Today's mission was supposed to be easy. Replace a couple aging coolant hoses and call it a day. Unfortunately, I've owned cars long enough to know "while I'm in there" is one of the most expensive phrases in the automotive dictionary. Replacing the hoses? Might as well do the thermostat. Replacing the thermostat? Might as well do the fan switch. Draining the coolant? Might as well flush the entire system. So what started as a 30-minute maintenance job has quickly snowballed into a complete coolant system refresh. But every step gets this CRX one step closer to becoming the reliable daily driver I've always wanted it to be. So whether this ends with a perfectly running Honda or me covered in coolant and regret, it remains to be seen. So, let's get started. Before we start tearing into this thing, let's go over everything we're going to need for the job. I've got a new upper radiator hose, lower radiator hose, heater core hose, and some fresh overflow tubing. Basically, every hose that has betrayed me on my last CRX has made its way onto today's replacement list. For tools, I've got an assortment of pliers because these factory spring clips have been heat cycling since like the early 90s and I know are not about to cooperate willingly. This part of the job usually requires equal amounts of patience, creativity, and mild frustration, which I'm pretty good at. I've also got an impact ready to go. It's probably overkill for removing hose clamps, but since I'm replacing most of them with modern worm gear clamps, it'll make the installation a whole lot faster. While we're already draining the coolant system, we're also replacing the thermostat and radiator fan switch, two more components that have left me stranded in the past. At this point, we're basically eliminating suspects before they have the chance to commit the crime. A few screwdrivers, picks, pry tools will help persuade these old hoses to come off, and if persuasion doesn't work, well, that's why utility knives were invented. Last but not least, you'll need a drain pan to catch the coolant. And when I say drain pan, I mean one that actually is big enough for the job. Learn from my mistake. Future me is about to discover the coolant obeys laws of gravity a lot more faithfully than I obey the capacity rating of this pan. With everything laid out and ready to go, let's get the CRX in the air, pull the splash shield, and drain the coolant so we can finally start this overhaul. With the splash shield out of the way, we finally have access to the three main players underneath the car: the radiator drain plug, the radiator fan switch, and the lower radiator hose. We'll spend most of our time down here draining the coolant before moving the fan switch and disconnecting the lower hose. But before opening up the drain plug, I wanted to head back up on top to remove the radiator cap. That allows air into the system and helps the coolant flow out much faster. What I failed to account for was exactly how much faster. Beep, beep. You see, I carefully positioned this drain pan based on years of engineering experience, advanced fluid dynamics, and at least 3 seconds of visual estimation. Unfortunately, my calculations assumed the coolant would politely drip straight down. Instead, the moment I pulled the plug, the radiator launched a pressurized coolant stream that completely ignored my drain pan and introduced itself onto the garage floor. So if you're following along at home, make sure your drain pan is positioned a little bit further away than you might think. Unlike me, you can learn from the lesson before creating your own coolant-themed slip and slide.
Didn't look that on camera. It's sweet.
Now that I've successfully demonstrated what not to do, let's get this system drained. With the coolant finally drained, I took a few minutes to clean up some of the rust and buildup around the radiator cap area before flushing everything back through the system. For the flush itself, I'm using pressed stone cooling system flush and following the instructions provided on the bottle. The goal here isn't just to replace old coolant, but to remove as much sediment, scale, and contamination from the coolant system as possible before everything gets reassembled. But before we do the flush, let's move on to replacing the thermostat and old radiator hoses. On the CRX, the thermostat is located inside the thermostat housing at the end of the lower radiator hose. To get access to it, we'll need to remove the hose and unbolt the outer housing. Of course, before we get there, we need a little bit more room to work. So out comes the battery and the intake system. Honda engineers were kind enough to leave just enough space to do this job, if your hands happen to be the size of a petite Japanese woman. With everything out the way, we can finally get a good look at the thermostat housing and remove the bolts to secure the outer cover. Now comes everyone's favorite part, removing 30-plus-year-old hose clamps.
Please, no!
These original spring clamps have spent decades heat cycling, rusting, and bonding themselves to every single hose they touch. What should be a very simple removal process quickly turned into a test of patience, grip strength, and vocabulary. I tried multiple styles of pliers, hose clamps, pry tools, and just about every combination I could think of. Some clamps came out easy, while others thought it was like they were protecting Epstein files or something.
FBI, open up!
Eventually, persistence wins, and we can start removing the outer hoses one by one. The upper radiator hose was especially stubborn and required a little extra persuasion before finally breaking free.
Do it!
Once the hoses were removed, I cleaned up the hard pipe connections as thoroughly as possible. Any corrosion, debris, or old rubber left behind can make sealing the new hose a lot more difficult. So spending a few extra minutes here can really help prevent leaks moving forward. And with the mating surface cleaned up and ready to go, we're finally at the point where we can start installing the new coolant system components. With the upper radiator hose finally removed, I wanted to compare it to the new one. At first glance, the old hose actually didn't look that bad. No obvious cracks, no major swelling, and it probably could have kept doing its job for a while longer. But that's exactly the point of preventative maintenance. I have no idea when this hose was last replaced, if ever, and I'd much rather swap it out in my garage than on the side of the road. With the new upper hose installed, it's time to move underneath the car and tackle the lower radiator hose. Unfortunately, Honda decided to place one of the hose clamps in the location that could only be described as technically accessible.
Okay.
To make matters even worse, the radiator fan switch is right in the way, so that has to be disconnected before you can even start fighting with the clamp. And trust me, this clamp put up a fight. Out of all the clamps on the car, this one by far was the most stubborn. It took every combination of pliers, levers, determination, and questionable language I had available before the hose finally broke free. And once removed, it was pretty obvious why we were replacing it. Compared to the new one, the old one felt tired, worn, and noticeably softer. It may not have failed today, but it definitely wasn't getting any younger. Before installing the new hose, I transferred over the factory heat shield and retaining clips. I also took the opportunity to replace the original spring clamps with worm gear clamps. Purists may disagree, but future Frankie won't have to wrestle these things ever again, and that's a win in my book. However, before that lower hose can completely go back on, there's one more component we have to replace, the thermostat. To access it, you'll first need to remove this electrical connector bracket along with two 10mm bolts holding the thermostat housing together. Once the housing is separated, the thermostat can be removed and you'll probably find an old gasket stuck to one side, just like mine was. Make sure to thoroughly clean the gasket before installing the new thermostat, because any leftover gasket material can prevent an improper seal and lead to leaks down the road, meaning this job has to get done again.
No!
Now, this would be a great time to install the new thermostat gasket, if I actually bought one. So after making it this far into the job, I got to enjoy the traditional project car experience, an emergency parts store run to AutoZone. We've all been there. With the correct gasket finally in hand, I can install the new thermostat. But keep in mind, one important detail to pay attention to is its orientation. Most thermostats have a bleed hole, jiggle valve, or alignment part that needs to face upwards during installation. Mine had a small indicator showing the proper orientation, so make sure to note how yours is positioned before removing it. Since we're already working in the area, I decided to replace one more aging coolant hose and simplify things just a bit. The factory setup used a small hard pipe routed between components, and instead, I replaced it with a single section of fresh hose cut to the same length. Will it make maintenance easier in the future? Maybe. Will removing one tiny piece of metal somehow improve performance through weight reduction? Absolutely not. But if I tell myself I added at least half a horsepower, then the entire coolant overhaul just became a performance modification. So it's justified. With the new thermostat and gasket ready to go, I made sure to match the orientation of the original before dropping it into the housing. This is one of those little details that's easy to overlook, but can cause big headaches later if installed incorrectly. Before reinstalling the thermostat housing, I applied a thin layer of RTV gasket maker to the outer housing. Is it absolutely required? Probably not, but after spending this much time replacing every cooling component on the car, the last thing I wanted was a tiny leak forcing me to tear it all back apart. With the housing carefully installed, I threaded in the two 10mm bolts and snugged them down just enough to hold everything in place. But instead of fully torquing them down immediately, I wanted to give the RTV plenty of time to cure. So, this project officially turned into a multi-day event. Then, I waited another day just to give the gasket every chance to fully cure before introducing cooling back into the system. Could I have rushed it? Sure. Did I want to find out the hard way that patience would have been cheaper? Absolutely not. After 2 days, I was finally confident everything had cured, so the lower radiator hose could finally be installed using the new worm gear clamps. Right about this time, my wife looked out of the garage, realized I'd somehow turned the coolant hose replacement into a 3-day engineering project, and brought me an espresso. She's a keeper. Fueled by caffeine and questionable levels of confidence, I noticed something else. There were still some old hoses that needed to get replaced. Apparently, while I'm in there, wasn't finished with me just yet. Since I already had the cooling system torn apart, I removed the coolant overflow reservoir so I could give it a proper cleaning. Years of old coolant had left a surprising amount of residue inside, and with it already out of the car, there wasn't really any better time to clean it up. And of course, once the tank was out, I figured I might as well replace every overflow hose connected to it as well. At this point, preventative maintenance had become less of a task and more of a personality trait. As each hose came off, I cut a new section to match it to length before transferring over any factory heat shields and hardware. It does take a little extra time, but reusing those protective pieces helps keep the new hoses from cooking next to the hot engine components. With every hose finally replaced, the engine bay was starting to look a whole lot fresher than where we started. I gave everything one final inspection, made sure every clamp was tight, every electrical connector was plugged back in, and made sure my 10mm socket was back in its toolbox. Satisfied that everything looked good, it was finally time to reinstall the intake, drop the battery back in, and move on to the moment of truth, the coolant flush. With everything finally back together, it was time for the moment of truth, the coolant flush. Like I mentioned, I'm using the press-down coolant system flush and follow the directions directly on the bottle. The process is pretty straightforward. Pour the entire bottle into the radiator, top the rest off with water, and let the engine run. Depending on how dirty your cooling system is, the recommended runtime can range anywhere from about 15 minutes to several hours. Since this engine was sitting for a decade but wasn't completely neglected, I split the difference and let it idle for roughly 30 to 45 minutes. While it was running, I kept an eye on the temperature gauge and periodically felt the upper radiator hose to confirm that the thermostat had opened. Once the thermostat opens, you know the flush is circulating through the entire cooling system instead of just in the engine block. One thing I wasn't expecting was how much the cleaner likes to foam. As the engine warms up and you occasionally raise the RPM, you'll probably notice bubbles and foam collecting around the radiator neck. Don't panic, it's completely normal.
Alright, and just like that, we went ahead and flushed the entire coolant system from the CRX. We essentially replaced upper, lower coolant hoses. We did a flush for the whole system for the coolant. And right now that's what we're doing. We're just letting it rest and idle for the next 15 to 20 minutes. Get all the gunk and stuff that's built up over the years. Get it all removed, and then essentially what we're going to do is drain it all out after and then fill it back up with brand new coolant. So that's what I have here. I'm already prepared. I have my coolant pan on here. I'm essentially going to go in and loosen it and then let everything sit in here. Might need 2 passes. Basically transport that into a container like that so I can recycle it at AutoZone. And like I said, at that point, do the exact same process that I'm doing now, which is purging the system. This whole process should have taken, like I said, a day or 2 less, but since I put the gasket and let it have to wait a day and then I had plans, essentially that's why we didn't get it done in the time frame that I anticipated. But if you were doing this at home, you could for sure do this in a weekend, no problem at all. And now you have the peace of mind, like I do, that I'm not going to overheat, knock on wood, and for anything coming up in the future. So it's all about preventative maintenance, not about getting stranded on the side of the road. So let's go ahead and finish this up and finish up the video as far as how to replace upper and lower radiator hoses, and also how to do a coolant flush on the 87 CRX.
Once the flush cycle was complete, I drained everything out and started flushing the system with clean water. There isn't a one and done process. I kept filling the radiator with fresh water, bringing the engine up to temperature, and draining it again until the water came out looking just as clean as the water going in. For this CRX, that ended up taking about 4 or 5 complete flushes before I was happy with the results. It does take a little longer, but if you're already this far into the job, you might as well finish it properly. One thing that's just as important as replacing the parts is disposing of the old coolant responsibly. Use antifreeze is hazardous to both people and animals, so don't dump it down the drain or on the ground. Most cities actually offer free household hazardous waste collection events, or have facilities that accept used coolant, so it's worth taking a few extra minutes to dispose of it the right way. With the system completely clean, all that was left was filling it with fresh antifreeze. I slowly filled the radiator while allowing the engine to burp up any trapped air in the cooling system. As the air bubbles worked their way out, I continued topping it off until the bubbles stopped and the coolant level remained steady. At that point, I installed the radiator cap and filled the overflow reservoir to the proper level. For the next few drives, I'll keep an eye on the temperature gauge and check the overflow reservoir, since it's completely normal for the coolant level to change slightly as the remaining air works out of the system. And just like that, the cooling system overhaul is complete. What started as replacing a couple coolant hoses somehow turned into new hoses, a thermostat, a fan switch, fresh clamps, a cleaned overflow tank, and a complete cooling system flush. But honestly, that's exactly how project cars go. The difference is now that I know exactly what's inside the cooling system. No more surprises. I don't have to wonder whether a 30-year-old hose is going to split open on the next drive, or whether an old thermostat is waiting to leave me stranded. That's one more major system checked off the list. One more step towards making a CRX a reliable daily driver. And one less thing keeping this car from getting back on the road where it belongs. If you enjoyed this video or learned something along the way, consider leaving a like or subscribing, because we're getting closer and closer to driving the CRX every single episode. So with that being said, thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Like always, stay boosted.